October 1944, a liberated village near Saarbrücken, Germany. Rain falls on empty streets, muddy fields, and silent stone houses. Women gather at the well, their faces drawn, their eyes fixed on the muddy road where American military vehicles idle. Old men sit on porches, watching the sky. Children play quietly in the doorways. But there are no young men working the fields, no adult sons helping their mothers, and no fathers coming home from the shops. A strange, heavy silence hangs over the entire community. Every single male between the ages of 14 and 60 is gone from this place, wiped clean from the landscape. General George S. Patton will soon uncover the dark reality behind this sudden disappearance. He will make sure the men who stole an entire generation face a punishment that mirrors their own crime. This is the story of what Patton did when he entered a village where every male over 14 had been taken for forced labor. It is a story about the unseen cost of war and the measures required to restore basic human decency to a broken land. Before we continue, make sure you subscribe. We tell the World War II stories that show the truth buried under the rubble of retreat. Sergeant Margaret Walsh was 28 years old, hailing from the windy plains of Omaha, Nebraska, and served as a civil affairs non-commissioned officer in the United States Third Army. Back home, she had worked as a county clerk, a job that taught her the quiet importance of names, records, and numbers. Her brother had been captured in North Africa, leaving her family with a hollow ache and a drawer full of unread letters, which drove her to enlist so she could help piece broken communities back together. She had seen the wreckage of Normandy and the shattered ruins of northern France, but nothing prepared her for the eerie stillness of this border zone. Armed with nothing but a government-issued clipboard, a fountain pen, and a stack of lined paper, she was the first American soldier to sit down with the weeping village women to document the exact scale of the crime. Major Heinrich Schuster was a 44-year-old Wehrmacht officer from Kassel, Germany, who viewed the local populace through the cold lens of military arithmetic. Raised in a strict Prussian household, he believed the survival of the Reich superseded all laws of humanity, frequently stating that individual lives were merely fuel for the state machine. He carried himself with an icy, unearned privilege, keeping his custom-tailored gray uniform immaculately pressed and his high leather boots polished to a mirror shine despite the surrounding sea of mud. He had been assigned to the region with strict orders to fill labor battalions for the construction of the Siegfried Line, a task he completed with brutal efficiency. His written orders from the regional command explicitly demanded a quota of 70 males from the district, but he intentionally rounded up 73 just to prove his superior devotion to the high command. He regarded the local people not as citizens, but as raw physical material to be consumed by the engineering units of the German army. By the autumn of 1944, the structural framework of the German military machine was fracturing along the Western Front. The rapid Allied advance across France had pushed the combat zone directly to the borders of the Reich, forcing the Nazi leadership to adopt desperate measures to halt the oncoming collapse. Sweeping decrees from Berlin demanded the immediate reinforcement of the West Wall, a massive system of bunkers, trenches, and concrete anti-tank obstacles stretching hundreds of miles along the frontier. Because regular combat divisions were fully engaged in slowing the front-line assault, the responsibility for building these defenses fell upon regional commanders, who relied heavily on forced civilian labor. In the widespread chaos of the retreat, local administrative oversight vanished entirely, leaving individual military detachments to operate with absolute authority over the occupied zones. Many tactical commanders chose to look the other way when local units stripped populations bare, viewing the internal security of the defensive line as far more critical than international legal agreements. This operational desperation allowed predatory officers to exploit isolated rural populations without fear of immediate intervention from their higher staff. Entire farming communities were systematically emptied of their workforce overnight, as logistics officers prioritized immediate construction quotas over the survival of the rural infrastructure. In this broken administrative environment, an officer with a truck convoy and a signed order could effectively erase the male presence from an entire district within a matter of hours. The village near Saarbrücken became a quiet casualty of this defensive frenzy, leaving a handful of desperate women to manage the autumn harvest alone while the front line rapidly closed in on their silent homes. Sergeant Walsh walked into the damp stone municipal office, her boots tracking wet clay across the threshold. Major Schuster sat at a heavy oak desk, slowly turning the pages of a small leather ledger while warming his hands over a portable kerosene heater. The American sergeant placed her clipboard firmly on the desk directly over his paperwork. She asked for the current deployment roster of the Regional Labor Command. The German officer did not look up immediately, instead tracing the spine of his book with a manicured fingernail. He stated that military labor allocations were internal matters of the Reich and entirely outside the scope of an administrative survey. Sergeant Walsh adjusted her stance, pointing directly to the list of 73 local names she had compiled from the village families. She noted that international conventions prohibited the forced conscription of non-combatant populations and demanded to know where the boys and elderly men had been transported. Major Schuster leaned back in his chair, a faint smile touching his lips as he adjusted the collar of his tailored uniform. He told her that a state fighting for its existence recognizes no legal boundaries regarding the use of manual labor. He explained that 70 men were required by his directive to secure the eastern perimeter, and the extra 3 were simply a margin of safety for the construction schedule. The sergeant reminded him that a 14-year-old boy and a 60-year-old farmer with a severe heart condition were included in his collection. She stated that these individuals were legally classified as protected persons, not construction resources. The major brushed a speck of dust from his sleeve and stood up to face her. He declared that every person in the district belonged to the state machine, adding that if the old man could dig, he would serve, and if he died, he would still serve the purpose of the Reich. He told her that small-town clerks from America could not comprehend the total mobilization of a superior nation. Sergeant Walsh realized the negotiation had reached its absolute limit. She picked up her clipboard, turned on her heel, and walked out into the rain to find a radio vehicle. The report reached Patton within the hour. Patton arrived within the hour. His open-top command jeep splattered thick mud across the limestone walls of the municipal building as it skidded to a halt. The 3 silver stars on his helmet gleamed dull under the gray sky, and the twin ivory-handled revolvers rested low on his hips. He walked into the room unannounced, his heavy boots striking the floorboards with a slow, deliberate cadence. Every soldier in the room snapped to attention, and the air grew instantly cold. The general did not take off his leather gloves. He did not look at the maps on the wall, and he did not raise his voice. He walked directly to the heavy oak desk and looked down at the German officer. Patton studied him. He asked if the major was the officer responsible for the labor drafts in this district. Schuster stood straight, adjusted his tunic, and answered that he was. Patton asked if the major had personally ordered the removal of 73 males from the surrounding farms. Schuster stated that he had done so under the direct authority of his engineering command. Patton asked if the major had received an explicit waiver to conscript children and men with diagnosed cardiac conditions. Schuster replied that total war required total sacrifice from everyone. Patton asked if the major believed that written quotas placed an officer above the laws of field custody. Schuster answered that his only duty was to ensure the completion of the defensive trench line before the arrival of the American tanks. You talk about total mobilization as if it were a shield for your own numbers, Patton said. You took 73 men and boys from this village because it was easier to strip a civilian population than to manage your own engineering battalions. You told a local doctor that an old man with a failing heart could either dig or die in the mud because you saw him as a tool to be discarded when his spirit broke. You took 3 extra boys just to make your ledger look impressive to a staff colonel in the rear, leaving a town of women to dig their own crops out of the freezing earth. Now you will learn how a real army measures labor. Your defensive trenches are currently 6 miles east of this position, half finished and filled with rainwater. You have a choice. You can pick up a standard Pioneer shovel and lead your own staff officers out to those work sites to finish the digging yourself. Or you can face an immediate military tribunal for unlawful conscription. 2 options. Pick one in the next 10 seconds. If you choose the shovel, you will dig until every square yard of that fortification matches the original blueprint you tried to build with the lives of children. If you refuse, you will be handed over to the local guard details as a common criminal. Decide now. Major Schuster looked at the 4 stars on the general's collar, then at the silent American guards standing by the doorway with their rifles raised. His hand drifted toward his polished belt, but his fingers trembled against the leather. He lowered his head, reached down to the corner of the desk, and slowly picked up the iron-bladed tool. The guard details marched Major Schuster and his remaining staff out to the eastern perimeter lines before the morning mist had fully cleared. The German officer stood in the deep mud of the half-finished trench, his polished leather boots sinking into the clay, and his custom-tailored gray uniform quickly becoming soaked by the freezing rain. Around him, a ring of American infantrymen stood with their rifles ready, watching every movement while local village women gathered along the muddy ridge to witness the scene. Schuster lifted the heavy, iron-bladed Pioneer shovel, his hands blistering within the first hour as he threw wet gravel over the parapet. He smelled the stagnant water in the ditch, the raw earth, and the exhaust fumes from the idling American trucks that lined the adjacent road. The arrogance left his face as the hours wore on, replaced by the heavy exhaustion of manual labor under the cold October sky. The village women stood in silence, watching the man who had ordered their families, taken now clearing the very earth he had sought to claim. Every stroke of the shovel echoed across the open fields, serving as a public accounting for the 73 names recorded on the civil affairs clipboard. By nightfall, the immaculate uniform was ruined, and the officer who had viewed people as raw resources was reduced to a solitary figure digging in the dirt. Sergeant Margaret Walsh returned to Omaha, Nebraska after the end of her deployment, resuming her work within the municipal administration and organizing county land records until her quiet retirement in 1978. She kept the worn leather clipboard and the original penciled list of 73 names in her cedar chest, never speaking of the Saarbrücken border village to her neighbors, though she frequently stared at the fading ink during the long winter evenings before her passing in 1994. Major Heinrich Schuster spent 3 years in an Allied internment camp undergoing extensive legal processing before being released during the bureaucratic restructuring of Western Germany in 1948. He returned to his family estate near Kassel, living out his remaining years as a bitter regional aggregate supply manager, completely ignored by his community, until his solitary death in 1971. General George Patton never included the specific administrative details of the village labor dispute in his official operational logs, though he briefly mentioned the problem of civilian restoration in a private diary entry written 3 days after the confrontation. He noted that a true commander must measure the preservation of people with the same absolute precision used to calculate the expenditure of fuel and artillery ammunition. Some historians have argued that Patton exceeded his traditional tactical authority by redirecting German military engineering resources for localized social restitution during a critical phase of the frontier advance. They claim that frontline commanders should focus exclusively on destroying enemy combat formations rather than regulating regional civil administration or correcting local labor abuses. Others have argued the opposite, maintaining that the stabilization of the rear areas and the enforcement of international legal standards were vital to maintaining institutional order behind the advancing armored divisions. What is certain is that the complete registry of 73 names compiled in the district provided an unassailable record that forced local administrative authorities to acknowledge the exact human cost of the retreat. If you had been in Patton's position, would you have done the same? Or would you have left the tracking of these missing laborers entirely to the rear echelon bureaucracy? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about the truth buried under the rubble of retreat, make sure to subscribe.